In April 1770, Aborigines on the east coast of Australia saw a sailing ship for the first time. The Endeavour, 20 months at sea, sailed northwards, charting the coastline and searching for a suitable bay to anchor. Through his telescope, Captain James Cook observed the smoke of Aboriginal fires and scrutinized the faces of a people whose future would be indelibly shaped by the results of his voyage. The sails of the English ships were the symbol of a gale, which in the following century crossed the continent, extinguishing the flames of thousands of campfires. Burying with sand the fishing nets and grinding stones, silencing the sounds of hundreds of languages, and stripping the ancient Aboriginal names from rivers, valleys, and headlands. This is the story of Aboriginal society before that fateful collision of cultures, and the surprising suggestion by archaeologists that the Aborigines were at one time in human history the most modern and advanced human beings on Earth. By 1960, very little archaeological work had been carried out in Australia, but it was commonly assumed that the Aborigines first occupied the continent less than 10,000 years ago, a relatively recent human event. The real extent of Aboriginal occupation only became apparent during the excavation of Kenneth Cave in southern Queensland. Graham Walsh, site recorder for the Queensland National Parks and Wildlife Service.
I suppose I've got a biased opinion, but I think it's probably one of the most significant sites. Well, when you look back on it historically, in archaeology, I suppose it's the site that put Australia on the world archaeological map. And I mean, no matter what they find from here on, it can't be as significant as a big one, and this is the big one. And it's not just an archaeological site, I think it just ties the whole history of the people and archaeology into one incredible setting.
Professor John Mulvaney from the Australian National University first heard of the cave from a radio operator for the Flying Doctor Service and organised an excavation that became a milestone in Australian archaeology. Close to the surface, they found fine stone tools, typical of Aboriginal technology of the last 5,000 years. But as they excavated further, they were surprised to unearth larger stone tools, evidence of a more ancient technology. Charcoal samples from the soil were hurriedly sent to London for carbon dating. Back at Kenneth Cave, John Mulvaney awaited the results.
Reg Orr of the Royal Flying Doctor Service had contacted the Charleville base, and he'd picked up a telegram from my wife sent from Melbourne. And this said that the radiocarbon date for the earliest sample was 12,000 years. And frankly, I thought there'd been a naught added in the cable. It was terribly significant because at that stage, this was really the sound barrier. Anything earlier than 10,000 years put Aborigines in Australia during the Ice Age. There were hints that that was so from elsewhere, but this was the first real positive, hard data. Reg Orr sent a telegram back to my wife, and porridge time next morning we got the answer, 12,000 confirmed. So there was great jubilation in camp.
Further excavation put habitation at Kenneth Cave at 19,000 years, double that previously expected, and offered the first concrete evidence of people occupying Australia during the Ice Age.
Oh, well, as Mulvaney mentioned in his write-up in there, that if only one family group of, say, 20 people visited this site and camped there one night a year over a period of 19,000 years, you've got 38,000 people camping in there, and obviously in a rich area like this, there would have been more than one family group a year staying there. So incredible, thousands of people must have camped in the site, no matter what way you look at it. Yeah, it's pretty impressive. There wouldn't have been many sites in Australia, I think, that have had the number of people so that this one has, really.
The discoveries at Kenneth Cave were a breakthrough, but for all they revealed about the history of Aboriginal occupation, there were no clues as to their origin. Ever since their distinctive appearance was described by early European voyagers, many theories exploring their origins have been put forward. It was suggested that they might have come from Sri Lanka or India. Some even thought Africa. During the first half of this century, a number of human skulls were found, many of them anatomically more ancient than those of modern Aborigines. It was thought that these ancient-looking people were direct descendants of Homo erectus, who lived on the island of Java over 1 million years ago. In 1967, anatomist Dr. Alan Thorne made a discovery in northern Victoria that seemed to support this view.
The Museum of Victoria asked me to catalogue and analyse some of their human remains. And while I was doing that, I found these very old bones, encrusted bones, in the back of a box. And with the curator at the museum, we found the general area where the bones probably came from and set about going through each of the different possibilities.
From a 43-year-old police report, Alan Thorne traced the bones to Cow Swamp in northern Victoria, a swamp formed at the end of the Ice Age 15,000 years ago. The bones were unearthed in 1925 during the construction of an irrigation canal.
We had great trouble finding things out simply because the man who had originally found these bones had sold the property, and by a great stroke of luck, the day before we arrived to search for the bones, the original owner turned up and actually put a spike in the ground and made our job very easy.
And we found the first skeleton, or parts of it, and put those together, established that the bones from the property at Cow Swamp and the fragments of bone that I had from the museum were one and the same skeleton, and that established the site. And very soon afterwards, some of the local property owners said, well, there are some more bones that are being disturbed and eroding out of the ground. And so we went and excavated those, and so began this very lengthy and extensive project of the Cow Swamp burial ground.
Alan Thorne's outstanding detective work resulted in an excavation lasting 4 years, and the discovery of one of the largest prehistoric burial sites found anywhere. The Cow Swamp people had buried their dead beside the swamp for over 300 generations, from 15,000 to 9,000 years ago, evidence of the strong bond Aboriginal people have with their tribal land.
Cow Swamp produced a lengthy record of burials of probably more than 50 individuals, and from those burials we were able to get a very detailed record of not only physical characteristics of people in that area all the way back to 15,000 years ago, but also a number of cultural things, especially to do with burials and the disposal of the dead.
All the disposals of the bodies at Cow Swamp are simple burials. That is, a corpse was put into a prepared hole in the ground. But there are some individuals who are adult, some who are juvenile, one case of a newborn infant, the full range of a society represented in the burials at Cow Swamp. There's evidence of ochre being poured over some of the bodies. Some of them have pillows of mussel shells that are lying under the head, and in the case of one adolescent girl, there's a necklet or a headband that's been put across her forehead of kangaroo teeth.
The most unusual thing, and certainly to me the most exciting thing about Cow Swamp, was the anatomical differences that they showed to modern Aboriginal people. And I can show you on this cast of one of the skulls from Cow Swamp. Now, the Cow Swamp people are in general very much more robust. They have much more heavily built bones. Their skulls, as well as the other bones, are thicker than those of modern human beings, including modern Aboriginal people. But there's a whole set of characters in the skull which are quite different. The skulls are much bigger and much longer, and they have these huge, wide and very projecting faces that are quite different from modern Aboriginal people. The faces are very broad, and they have these huge cheekbones, and above these big brow ridges, and huge teeth and jaws, the the lower jaws together make these massive faces which really project out from the rest of the skull. And above the brows, as you can see, there are these very retreating foreheads. And this is one of the real clues, not just as the ancestry of these people in relation to modern Aboriginal people, but to the whole ancestry and geographical source from which these, and in general, modern Aboriginal people came from overseas.
Anatomically, the cow swamp people were consistent with the theory that Aborigines had descended from the ancient Javanese people. But nearby, new evidence was to surface that would complicate this theory. In 1968, the haunting landscape of Lake Mungo in western New South Wales became centre stage for a discovery that would rewrite not only Australian, but world prehistory. Riding his motorbike across the dunes of Lake Mungo, climatologist Dr. Jim Bowler came across what looked like bones on the surface of the sand. On closer inspection, he thought them to be human bones. An expedition followed with some of Australia's leading archaeologists, eagerly hoping for further clues about the Aboriginal occupation of Australia. None were prepared for what was to come. Again, the bones were examined by Dr. Alan Thorne.
They handed them over to me thinking that they were probably human, and they were right. There were burnt fragments of human bone, all mixed up together, hands and feet, bits of head, bits of backbone, all jammed together in no particular order in this series of blocks of sand. And it took me almost 6 months to dig each of them out of the sand, clean them up and begin to patch them together. And what I came up with, as far as the skull was concerned, was this. The top part of the head of a young adult woman. And what was really remarkable about them was, as you can see here in this cast, how extraordinarily thin they were, and also generally how delicate and absolutely modern. In fact, the dating which appeared at the same time was that this particular human was about 25,000 years old. At that time, the oldest example of a modern, completely modern human being found anywhere else in the world. And also, this was the oldest, and still is, the world's oldest human cremation. That is, where someone has been deliberately burnt as part of the disposal of the dead.
The discovery of Mungo Woman raised more questions than it answered. She was totally modern, yet she'd lived and died 10,000 years before the ancient-looking people from Cow Swamp. Could it be that there were two very different people living in Australia, side by side? Archaeologists looked to Lake Mungo for further clues. Resident archaeologist at Lake Mungo National Park, Peter Clark.
Mungo's a unique place in terms of the geography and the landscape. It's one of the most unique lakes in Australia and in the world. 40,000 years ago, the lakes were full. The dune here at the edge of the lake was receiving sediment which effectively sealed in individual occupational events at the time when some of the first ancestral Aborigines set foot in this part of Australia. So this recent erosion we see is cutting down, slicing through time, and we can observe the nature of occupation right from 30 and 40,000 years ago through to the present. That's very unique. This is the physical remains of a campfire which was used by someone sometime in the past. People were using fire for cooking, for warming, for ceremonial purposes, for medicinal uses. People were conceived, they were born, they lived and they died around fires. So fire can be regarded as focal points of human activity in the landscape. And around them we find the remains of what they were doing in the landscape. We find stone tools, for instance. Around here, there's small flakes, scrapers and so forth. And if we're able to map the distribution of these campsites through space and time, we're able to understand how people behaved in the landscape, how they were able to adapt to changes in the environment which was brought on by changes in climate. We find lots and lots of bones. Most of those are hairy-nosed wombats and bettongs, animals which died in their burrows. But we also find the remains of animals which were cooked and eaten. Very occasionally you come across human burials. It's very unusual to find burials intact. Mostly you'll walk across the surface and see merely a few fragments, just a few pieces of skull or whatever, and that's all that's left of a human. The irony of this situation is that whilst erosion and weathering is exposing the strata and the contents in the strata, at the same time it's destroying it. So it's crucial that we collect this information as it's being destroyed.
A few years later, in the same vicinity as the discovery of Mungo Woman, Dr. Jim Bowler made another major discovery. This time the body had been covered in red ochre, again evidence of ritual burial.
In this case, a man, again totally modern looking, and 28 to 32,000 years old. Once again, pushing back even further the presence in Australia of the earliest anatomically modern human beings. An extraordinary find, because it was so old and so extraordinarily modern for that age.
The discovery at Lake Mungo of another totally modern human being, even older than Mungo Woman, further suggested that two different peoples had lived in Australia side by side. But how long had they coexisted? An answer was found here on the shores of Lake Nichi, only 100 kilometers away. The remains of an extremely tall man were found. He measured 187 centimeters, or 6 foot 1.5 inches. His skull was remarkably similar to the Cow Swamp people and fell firmly within the same robust group. Around his neck, a necklace of 178 Tasmanian devil teeth. But the intriguing aspect of the giant Aboriginal man was that he lived only 6,500 years ago. Nowhere else in the world did such robust people live so recently.
When you put all the bones together from all of the sites in the Australian past, you find that there are two very different sorts of people. First of all, there are ones like these, in this case from Cow Swamp. Very big, very robust people with thick bone, huge projecting faces. And then there are examples like this, people who look like the people from Mungo, with their very modern, delicate looking faces and foreheads, small, broad, flat faces. Now these two people are not only different from one another, but both of them are very different from modern Aboriginal people. And almost clearly these two sorts of people fuse together to produce modern Aborigines. But they also give us clear indications of two different source areas from where these people came from. First of all, the robust people, who show clear links with much earlier people in Indonesia, particularly in the island of Java. The descendants of Java man, who in various ways that we don't understand, but by water, moved across the oceans and into Australia from Indonesia. And then there are people like these, the Mungo-like people, who show clear signs of links with people in Eastern Asia, particularly in China. And it seems as if they moved out in a variety of ways, but probably to reach Australia through the Philippines, and having occupied the Philippines, moved further south into New Guinea and therefore into Australia. Now, how these people came is not clear, but it must have been by water, and the Vietnamese boat people are really a good example of perhaps the latest flow of people, for a specific set of reasons, from Southeast Asia into Australia. In the modern case with Vietnamese, by motorised vessels, but 50,000 years ago by a variety of craft that we don't yet really understand.
The first ancestral Aborigines are now believed to have made their journey of discovery at least 50,000 years ago, during the Ice Age, when the level of the sea was much, much lower. People could almost walk from mainland Asia to Australia. But but each route would have required the crossing of between 60 and 100 kilometres of open sea. This would have to be regarded as the world's earliest sea voyage, and the Aborigines the world's first mariners. Why they came can only be speculated. Perhaps they were escaping from tribal difficulties, or fisher people blown out to sea by an angry storm. A day or two later, hungry, thirsty and weary, land came into view. An alien land of volcanoes and glaciers, strange animals and vegetation. For tens of thousands of years, their descendants would explore and inhabit this land, exposed to its extremes of landscapes and climate, developing a culture, the longest surviving culture on Earth. "50,000 years later, in 1901, Walter Baldwin Spencer, the director of the National Museum of Victoria, photographed the descendants of these early ancient mariners. Spencer, like other anthropologists of his time, saw Australia as a biological province frozen in time, a sort of Conan Doyle's Lost World, and recorded the lifestyle of a people he believed would inevitably die out.
It was assumed at that time that only European society really had what mattered, and that the Aborigines were relics from early time, and that the way of life they followed must have led them to starve and other things. In fact, their menu was much more balanced than, say, that of the convicts who came out here from urban London. It's always intrigued me that Europeans have such sympathy for poor old Birkin Wills, who died up at Cooper's Creek. They died of starvation, and yet well over 1,000 Aborigines were living very well-rounded and nutritious lives in that area. So it just does indicate that the Europeans hadn't appreciated the situation at all.
As late as the 1920s, Aborigines were categorised as an unchanging people in an unchanging environment. But the Australian environment did change, and so did its people. For almost 3/4 of their known occupation of the continent, the Aborigines had to survive the Ice Age, when average temperatures were 10 degrees colder than they are today. Archaeologists are now discovering evidence of Aboriginal occupation in places they didn't expect.
Have we mapped out all the there near the entrance?
I don't think we have actually. It's an important one, sort of. Should put it in.
In 1984, Dr. Josephine Flood and members of the Canberra Archaeological Society excavated a small rock shelter in the high country outside Canberra and found that people had visited the cave during the Ice Age. Dr. Josephine Flood.
This cave was found quite by chance. It is on Birrigai, which is an outdoor school field study centre, and it's on the history trail. And children were being brought through here by their teachers and scuffed with their feet artifacts out of the floor. So we came and just put in quite a small test pit And what we were delighted but surprised about was that this rather small rock shelter turned out to be a major site. And we've now got the radiocarbon dates back, and the occupation here started 18,000 years ago, which is right at the height of the last ice age. Now, this really was a surprise, and I've been doing research here for 15 years and haven't found a site that was more than 4,000 years old. So this has really changed the picture of Australian prehistory. What it shows is that Aboriginal people were utilising every sort of environment, including the real high mountain country, the cold country like this. And of course it would have been a lot colder 18,000 years ago. It would have been rather like living on the top of Mount Kosciuszko nowadays. So they had come to terms with an enormous range of different sorts of environments, including the really harsh ones, and that is remarkable.
I think I've got something here.
Oh, great.
Just put the marker in. Have a look at that, Joe.
Oh, very nice little piece of quartz, yes. What a beauty. Very nice sharp edges, quartz. We found about 60 stone artifacts, enough to show that people were up here at the height of the last ice age. One of the exciting finds was very tiny pieces of ochre, and some of those were beyond 15,000 years as well. So that means that they were not just existing up here, but that they were decorating either their bodies or perhaps doing paintings on the walls of the shelter, or possibly decorating their artifacts like boomerangs. So I think archaeology can really begin to paint at least the framework of a picture, though of course the detail we unfortunately will never know.
During the Ice Age, when the seas were at their lowest, Aborigines could walk from mainland Australia to Tasmania. In 1977, geomorphology student Kevin Kiernan travelled the Franklin River in southwest Tasmania and discovered the richest Ice Age site yet found in Australia. Archaeologist Dr. Rhys Jones.
In March 1981, a party of us from the Tasmania National Park Service, and including Kevin Kiernan, went up the Franklin River. And it took us all day to get through these rapids. And I remember that it came just to the nightfall, and it was totally dark, and it was raining heavily. We got off the river through this great bank of clay and pushing away through the rainforest in total darkness. And I thought, gosh, these are idiots, these people I was with. And suddenly I was aware that it had stopped raining. And I thought we were in a clearing in the bush. But in fact, they suddenly turned on their torches, and we were inside a huge cave. And this was the cave, then called Fraser Cave and now called Kutikaina. It only took us a few minutes, in fact, using our torches on the floor to see that the floor of this cave was covered with literally thousands of flakes of stone, of people who had been camping here. Now, we camped ourselves that night in the cave. We were probably the first people to do so for 14,000 years, because in a small excavation, which we did in the next couple of days, we were able to uncover one of the richest sites ever found in Australia. And in it, in only about half a cubic meter, there were some 40,000 flakes of stone and about 250,000 pieces of burnt animal bones. The top date, that is the very surface of the ground, was covered with a stalagmite layer, which we've got dated now with carbon dating to about 14,000 years. And at the base of the sequence, there was this gravel from which we've got a date of about 20,000 years. Now, human occupation of this site, therefore, corresponded in time with the height of the last ice age. This is very important because these people in southern Tasmania were then the most southerly humans on Earth during that time. And they were the only humans to have experienced the southern ice age at its harshest point. And it was really harsh because only about 3 or 4 kilometers away from the cave, there were glaciers, full glaciers, in the tops of the mountains. And to the south, you had the Antarctic ice sheet, perhaps 1,000 kilometers away, but certainly with icebergs coming up along the Tasmanian coast. And then at the time of the last ice age, in the northern hemisphere, you have the Paleolithic hunters of France and Germany, and perhaps even southern Britain. They were the hunters. These are the classic cavemen, if you like, of northern Europe, hunting close to the limits, close to the edge of the northern ice sheet. And then, in the southern part of the globe, at exactly the same time, you have other hunters, the ancestors of the Tasmanian Aborigines, the first Tasmanians, hunting on the edges of the southern ice sheets. And these southern hunters were the only people on Earth that far south at that time.
Kudikaina Cave is now being hailed as important in Australian history as Botany Bay, and is testimony not only to Aboriginal adaptability, but also to their pioneering endeavours. But people of the Ice Age were not preoccupied with survival. All over the world, it was the dawning of the human intellect. One of the most remarkable discoveries in Australian archaeology was made in Cunalda Cave, a limestone sinkhole below the Nullarbor Plain in South Australia. In 1971, a group from Sydney University, led by archaeologist Richard Wright, dug excavation pits and found evidence of Aborigines visiting the cave to mine flint. Quarrying had been done underground, and the flint taken elsewhere to be made into tools. Campfires and residue from the mining process were found and dated from 24,000 to 14,000 years before present, well within the last ice age. The cave was further explored and found to contain a series of cathedral-like chambers, mirror-like lakes, and steep boulder-clad slopes. In total darkness, 300 meters inside the cave, unusual markings were found on the walls. The markings were similar to the so-called macaroni style of the earliest art found in the caves of France and Spain. Many large flat walls were completely covered with random crisscrossing sets of parallel finger markings, herringbone designs, and outlines of hands. The explorers squeezed through a series of narrow passages and found further markings. Close to the surface of the ground, below one marked wall, charcoal was found. The charcoal could have come from crude torches held by the artists to light the dark passages in the deepest recesses of the cave, and was later dated at 20,000 years old. The tentative finger designs of Cunalda Cave were possibly produced in the course of ritual activity and may well have been the first step in the development of Aboriginal art, and are some of the oldest art yet dated not only in Australia, but in the world. In a country with natural wonders such as the Carnarvon Gorge in southern Queensland, the major landmarks were endowed with mythological significance and were often centres of religious and ceremonial life. Art was a vital part of that cultural life and was rarely created without purpose. Graham Walsh has studied stencil art for almost a decade.
One with the hand drooped over, Ross recorded as meaning to dive, shag, or diving bird. The one over there with the vertical arm is an emu. Hands up with the thumbs together in there, that means many. It is really a language, and I think that's an incredible thing for an Aboriginal art form. People who are into rock art look for the more flamboyant, and so Arnhem Land gets the preference with its big X-ray figures, and the Kimberley with its Wandjina figures. It's something people can see it from a European aesthetic value, I suppose. But when you come down to the real value of it all, stencil art has got to be one of the big things that tells you the story, because it's a portrayal of the artifacts and weaponry that people were using in day-to-day events. And look, there's a fair chance some of the stencil art that we're looking at is towards 20,000 years old, you may say. And if you can look at the stencils, which are a perfect replica, really, in ochre, of the artifacts that people used 20,000 years ago, that's got to be an incredible value, not just artistically, but scientifically. And you know, a lot of these weapons don't exist anymore. The only information we've got on weapons, as you'll see in Carnarvon Gorge here, the V-killer boomerangs and the little clubs, is the stencils. They've all gone. The only records on the rocks. So it's important, both from the Aboriginal cultural point of view and from the archaeological point of view, as a reference. I think by having the boomerang or the artefact in contact with the wall and stenciling it there, it's like the bond between the man and his country. It could be giving power from the site to the hunting or killing weapons, and that's possibly why you get so many depicted. I don't think they're just designs for sure, but that's only hypothesis at present. Well, Cathedral Cove is one of the largest art habitation shelters known anywhere in the Carnarvons so far, and I don't think we're going to find anything bigger than this one here. It's been used for art, habitation and burial sites in the early days. There's a wide range of stuff here, ranging from engraving, stencil art, freehand art, composite stencil art. It's got a bit of everything in it, so it's really important in that way. You can find beautiful big shelters where there's nothing in it at all, so it's not because they're nice shelters they're doing it in specific places for specific reasons. And I think they're probably dreaming spots or something like that. But you find it in most art areas all over Australia, not just stencil art, that people come and do their art in concentrated areas and superimpose them over the top of one another rather than take new areas. So the areas where the art is displayed has got to be very, very significant. You can't ignore that fact.
Aboriginal artistic traditions were not bound to the living sites. In the Carnarvon Gorge area, it had an important place in the burial of the dead.
The central Queensland sandstone belt, not just the Carnarvons, is, I think, is Australia-wide known for its mortuary culture, I suppose would be one way of putting it, where it's extremely advanced. The bark burial cylinders are just works of art, where they've prepared the bodies and put them in these bark containers and painted them with elaborate designs, yellow and red bands, and this field has been developed to a level almost like Egypt, if you want to look on those parallels. But it's not just the making of the cylinder and the whole culture that went with that. It's the fact that here we've got art definitely associated with these burial cylinders. And there's just a small hole like that in the bark cylinder is put inside there with the body skeletal remains wrapped up in bark, very elaborately painted up with red and yellow bands. And a lot of burial goods were put in with the bodies. It's just far more developed than we've got today. And I think the biggest fascination with people is that the Aborigines developed to such a high level. I mean, it's just so advanced, far more than us. It's something they can't look down, you've got to look up to.
Baldwin Spencer's rare film captured the simplicity and the complexities of their way of life. A way of life not preoccupied with material possessions. Their interests were in the life of the spirit and ceremony, their ties to the land, their mythology, and their oral literature. Hundreds of millions of Aborigines must have lived and died here since the arrival of their ancestors. Over 400 different tribes developed, each with its own distinct language and culture. Isolation from the rest of the world had allowed them to develop this way of life, but isolation was to be their downfall. "20,000 years ago, the world began to thaw from its icy epoch. As the ice at the poles melted, the oceans rose. It was a time of dramatic change. Immense areas of land were submerged. Hills on the continental shelves became islands. Tasmania and New Guinea were cut off from the mainland. About 1/7 of the landmass of Greater Australia, 2.5 million square kilometres, was inundated, drowning the grasslands where Aborigines had hunted for countless generations. Isolating them even further at a time when the other peoples of the world were beginning to domesticate plants and animals, discover metals, and more effective weapons. Equally, Aboriginal culture was not without change. They developed extensive trading networks and engineering skills, fish traps, canals, and stone houses. Their technology also evolved. The advent of the returning boomerang and the woomera were as revolutionary to their society as the nuclear weapon to ours. But no people of the earth have lived in isolation forever. With the coming of the Europeans, their diseases and superior weapons, Aboriginal civilization after a reign of at least 50,000 years, was almost destroyed. As the kangaroo would give way to the sheep and rabbit, so too would the man with the spear give way to the man with the gun. Little can be done to restore what has been lost. While Aborigines have sometimes said they see no need for archaeology, as they already know what happened in the past, they also acknowledge the value of scientific evidence that shows the tremendous length, continuity, and complexity of their culture. At Lake George, on the southern tablelands of New South Wales, evidence of a different type may push back Aboriginal occupation not only beyond 50,000 years, but beyond 100,000 years, and challenge the way all Australians view the unique environment in which they live. In 1976, when the lake was full, palynologist Dr. Gurdip Singh of the Australian National University drilled a 30-metre core from the lake bed. From pollen grains in the deposits, Dr. Singh found that the vegetation around Lake George dramatically changed about 130,000 years ago. This change in vegetation was also accompanied by a sudden increase of charcoal in the lake sediments. For hundreds of thousands of years, casuarina oak trees and rainforest species lined the shores of the lake. Suddenly, eucalypts became the dominant vegetation.
There are two possibilities which may have caused the changes in vegetation 130,000 years ago. One is that the climate may have changed to dry conditions. But the difficulty with climate is that we don't have similar evidence from other parts of the world. The other possibility is that man may have arrived in Australia 130,000 years ago, and with his bush burning practices, he may have actually increased the fire frequencies and led to the changes in vegetation from a fire-sensitive to a fire-adapted flora.
The Aborigines regularly burnt huge tracts of their country, promoting fresh grasses for the animals they hunted. Firestick farming had a great effect on the landscape generally, and the fire-sensitive oaks and rainforest would have been reduced, and in many areas ceased to exist, allowing dominance to vegetation that could withstand fire, such as the eucalypts. Ironically, the lush grasslands and open woodlands so admired by the early settlers were created by a people they regarded as aimless nomads. When the Aborigines were driven off their land and the light regular burning ceased, the old grass turned sour and scrub invaded the grasslands, forcing many settlers to abandon their newly acquired properties. Today, archaeologists are eagerly looking for evidence of prehistoric people around Lake George. Already, some indications have surfaced to suggest that Dr. Singh may be right. Dr. Rhys-Jones.
Here we are on the hill on the east side of Lake George. We're actually right on top of the Great Dividing Range here, and the rivers on that side all flow down into the Pacific Ocean. But although we're about 2 or 3 kilometers away from the present lake and at least 200 or 300 meters above the present lake, the whole hill here is mantled with a layer of sand, and the sand came up from the lake shore, blown up by the westerly winds. Now, this place was a very attractive camping place for prehistoric people, and present-day industrial workings on the site have revealed old camping places. You can see here where the wind has blown the sand away and it's exposed this old floor. This is a living floor which was lived on by prehistoric people. Now we can tell from behind here, this is where you've got charcoal from old fireplace, and you can see it's burnt the ground hard. This is an old hearth, perhaps an old cooking hearth. And from similar things to this, we've got dates of, say, 3.5 to 4,000 years old. Now here you find lots of stone tools on this surface, and there's a beautiful little core here, which was made from a piece of quartz crystal. And they must have brought it in from somewhere quite far away. And it's been struck in this way, forming these little flake scars. And pieces of flakes were taken away, which were very sharp. And then they were making from these very distinctive little implements. I've got two of them here, which are in situ, which are flakes from these cores, which is made from a chert, a red chert, like so. And what they did then with the flake, they took a hammerstone like this. You can see the area here which has been packed has been used as a hammerstone. And then they'd bash one end of the flake so as to blunt it. And they'd use that then as the barbs of a spear. And they put the blunted end then into a split on the side of a spear shaft in gum. And then they'd use the sharp end like so. Now these things we call Bondi points. And in this site, we've dated these things back to about 3,500 to 4,000 years ago.
It was the sign they were looking for. Prehistoric people had lived around Lake George. An excavation was organized and further discoveries were made.
We went down through sands underneath this layer to a depth of about 2 meters, and there's carbon going down halfway to a date of about 8,000 years. And underneath all this sand is an ancient soil, and in that soil are very large stone tools of a totally different type. These are shaped like horses' hooves. They're very weathered, and I think that they are of considerable antiquity, certainly older than 8,000 years, and almost certainly well within the last ice age.
The search will continue. There are hints, but yet no definite proof of the antiquity suggested by Singh. If archaeologists do find the evidence, it will prove that man was capable of crossing the seas 130,000 years ago. It will also imply that much of the unique Australian vegetation is not natural, but in fact an Aboriginal artifact.
I think if we can put two and two together at some future stage and show that it was in fact the arrival of man which caused these changes in vegetation, then for the first time in history, man will have been shown to change whole ecosystems on a continental scale, just as a result of his bush burning activities. Obviously, this would be considered as the biggest change in the environment at the hands of man in the entire history of the human race.
Again, the origin of the Aborigine is in question. Not far from the discovery of Mungo woman and Mungo man, the sands have revealed the remains of another prehistoric man. But this time he is not anatomically modern like the others. He is so robust looking, he makes even the cow swamp people appear modern. When he lived here is not yet known, but it is thought to be more than 50,000 years ago. Could the modern Mungo people have evolved from this ancient man and not have come from China as previously thought? Genetic researchers in Australia and the United States have studied the genes of living Aborigines and have put forward the provocative suggestion that modern man may have originated in Australia and spread out across the world 40,000 years ago. If this startling theory can be proven, Australia might one day be known as the cradle of the modern human race. This may be the future challenge for Australian archaeology. We will never know when the first footprint was made on an Australian beach. The earliest campsites are now beneath the sea, out of reach of the archaeologist. But what has been established through the findings of archaeology in only 20 years has rewritten human history and drawn a new picture of a dynamic and highly adaptive people whose art, religion, and social organizations were very sophisticated, and whose ingenuity and technological skills enabled them to survive in one of the most inhospitable countries in the world.
Aborigines, having been here such a long time, they have developed a way of life that is perhaps the oldest surviving way of life there is, and that in itself means a tremendous cultural heritage for Australia.